The year was 1906 October, and the evening light came through the cabin window like amber honey. Samuel Fletcher sat at his rough wooden table, his hands moving with the rhythm of ritual. Before him lay the Sharps Model 1874 rifle, the same weapon that had traveled with him through 3 decades of mountain living and one night that changed everything. His grandson Thomas watched from across the table. The boy was 19 now, tall and lean, like his father had been, with that same restless energy that comes to young men when they know they're about to leave home forever. Tomorrow Thomas would board a train east. Within a month he'd be on a ship to France. The Great War was calling and young men were answering. Sam's hands never stopped moving as he cleaned the rifle. The oiled rag moved down the 30-inch barrel with practiced strokes, checking the breech mechanism, wiping down the walnut stock that bore the scars of 17 years. The Sharps was old now, just like Sam. Both of them had been younger, once stronger, once more certain about the world and their place in it. "Grandfather," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence, "they say we'll be home by Christmas, that the war won't last long." Sam didn't look up from his work. He'd heard similar promises before, back in 1861, when he'd been younger than Thomas was now. The war between the states was supposed to be over by summer. It lasted 4 years and killed more Americans than all other wars combined. Men who made promises about how long wars would last were usually men who'd never been to war. "There are 3 kinds of courage, Thomas," Sam said, his voice carrying the gravel of age and too many years spent alone in these mountains. "The courage to fight, the courage to run, and the hardest of all, the courage to stay when every instinct screams at you to leave." Thomas leaned forward. He'd heard his grandfather's stories before, the ones about Antietam and the long march through Maryland, but this sounded different. This sounded personal in a way the war stories never were. "Which kind did you choose?" Thomas asked. Sam set down the rifle and looked at his grandson directly. The lamplight caught the scar that ran down his left cheek, the mark left by a Confederate cavalry saber during the bloodiest single day of American history. His hair was long and silver now, tied back with a strip of leather the way he'd worn it for 3 decades. His beard showed more white than brown, but his eyes were still sharp, still the eyes of a man who'd learned to see danger before it saw him. "All 3, Sam said, "but there was one kind that mattered most. Let me tell you about the woman who taught me which one really counted." He picked up the rifle again, checked the extractor spring the way he'd done 10,000 times before. This rifle had fired the shot that changed his life. It needed to be maintained, respected, remembered. "This was August of 1889, Sam began. 17 years ago now, though sometimes it feels like yesterday. 3 years after your grandmother Catherine died. 3 years I'd spent learning how to forget what it meant to be a person who lived in the world instead of just surviving in it." Thomas said nothing. His father had told him about Catherine's death, about how it had broken something in Sam that never quite healed right. But his father had been young then, just a boy himself, sent to live with relatives in town because Sam couldn't bear to look at anything that reminded him of what he'd lost. "I'd forgotten how to talk to people," Sam continued. "Forgotten how to care about anything except the next meal, the next trap to check the next day that needed to be survived. I'd made peace with being alone forever. Or I thought I had." The old man stood slowly, his joints protesting the way they did on cold evenings. He walked to the window and looked out at the mountains that had been his home, his prison, his monastery for so long. "Then I heard someone crying in the woods," he said, "and everything changed." The lamplight flickered. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. Sam's hands tightened on the windowsill as the memories came flooding back, as clear and sharp as the day they'd been made. "Her name was Grace," he said, "and she was tied to a tree." August 1889 arrived in the Appalachian Mountains the way it always did, with heat that pressed down like a physical weight in air so thick with moisture you could almost drink it. Sam Fletcher woke at 4:30 in the morning, his body's internal clock more reliable than any timepiece. The cabin was dark except for the faint gray light beginning to show through the single window. Beside his bed, within arm's reach, lay the Winchester Model 1873 rifle. Loaded, always loaded. His bare feet touched the packed dirt floor and found it cool. Summer heat hadn't penetrated down through the earth yet. Wouldn't until noon. He stood without making a sound, a habit from the war that never left him. Moving quietly meant staying alive. The fireplace was cold, just gray ash from yesterday's cooking fire. Sam knelt, and began the morning ritual of building heat and light. Pine kindling first arranged in a small teepee, then white oak logs, the kind that burned slow and steady. He used flint and steel to strike sparks into a nest of dried moss. Matches cost 5 cents a box and needed to be saved for emergencies. A man who knew how to make fire without matches was a man who could survive when the world failed him. The kindling caught. Small flames licked up through the teepee structure. Sam added larger pieces, carefully building the fire the way his father had taught him 40 years ago. Some knowledge was older than America itself, passed down through generations of men who'd learned that survival meant mastering the small things before you could attempt the large. Breakfast was simple because everything in Sam's life was simple now. Cornmeal mush cooked in an iron pot over the growing fire. A piece of dried venison jerky from the deer he'd killed 2 weeks before. Coffee, real coffee, rationed carefully because it cost 25 cents a pound and his income from trapping barely covered necessities. He ate in silence, listening to the morning sounds. Birds beginning their day calls, the creak of cabin logs expanding as the temperature shifted, his own breathing. After Catherine died, Sam had discovered that silence wasn't empty. It was full of sounds most people never noticed because they were too busy filling space with words. After eating, he checked his trap line. 12 traps set over a 3-mile circuit through the mountains. Steel leg hold traps for fox and bobcat, deadfall traps for rabbit and squirrel, snare wire for grouse and turkey. Each trap needed checking every morning. An animal left too long would either die or chew its own leg off trying to escape. Sam didn't believe in making things suffer longer than necessary. Trap number 3 held a red fox, already dead neck, broken cleanly. The pelt would bring $1.50 in town, assuming Sam went to town, which he hadn't done in 2 weeks. Trap number 7 had been triggered, but sat empty. Something large had taken the bait, probably a bear. The deadfall was smashed, would need rebuilding. Trap number 11 held a rabbit still alive, eyes wide with terror. Sam knelt beside it and placed one hand gently on its head. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the first words he'd spoken out loud in 14 days. Then he made a quick motion with his knife, and the rabbit stopped struggling. Death came instantly. That was the only mercy Sam had left to give. He field dressed the rabbit there beside the trap, his movements automatic after 3 decades of practice. Slit the belly, remove the organs, save the liver and heart. These were the protein-rich pieces that would supplement tonight's cornmeal. The pelt would be stretched on a drying frame. 3 rabbit pelts could be sewn into a pair of winter gloves. Walking back to the cabin, Sam thought about nothing in particular and everything in general. This was his life now. Wake, eat, check traps clean, weapons read for an hour, sleep, repeat. It was a life stripped down to its essential elements, free from complication and connection and the terrible pain that came when you cared about something and then lost it. Inside the cabin, he cleaned his weapons before doing anything else. This was Army discipline that never left. Your weapon kept you alive, so you kept your weapon ready. The Sharps Model 1874 came first. Single shot, falling block action, 30-inch barrel, accurate to 1,000 yards. This rifle had cost $50 when Sam bought it in 1875, nearly 4 months of wages back then. Now it was priceless, irreplaceable. He opened the breech and looked down the barrel. Clean. He ran an oiled rag through it anyway. Mountain humidity caused rust, and rust caused misfires, and misfires caused death. The Colt single-action Army revolver came next. 6-shot single-action, 7.5-inch barrel. Sam had filed down the trigger years ago for a faster pull. The cavalry had taught him that fractions of a second mattered. He checked each chamber, wiped down the barrel, tested the cylinder rotation. Perfect. His weapons were the last connection to the man he'd been during the war. A soldier, a fighter, someone who mattered in the grand scheme of things. Now he was just an old hermit who talked to his horse and read dead people's poetry. The books sat on a shelf Catherine had insisted on building when they first moved into this cabin. Medical text, poetry, Shakespeare, things that seemed foolish and impractical until you understood that sometimes surviving meant more than just keeping your body alive. Sometimes it meant keeping the part of you that remembered how to be human. Today, Sam pulled down Macbeth. He opened to a random page and read, "Out damn spot, out I say." He closed the book. Lady Macbeth trying to wash blood off her hands that wasn't really there. Sam understood that feeling. He'd washed his hands 10,000 times since Antietam, and they still didn't feel clean. The morning stretched toward noon. Sam sat on his porch watching the forest thinking about nothing. This was meditation the way mountain men practiced it. Not sitting cross-legged and chanting, but sitting still and letting the world happen without trying to control it. He'd been alone for 14 days. Hadn't spoken to another human in 2 weeks. For that 3 weeks. Before that a month. The isolation didn't bother him anymore. It was easier than pretending to care about things that didn't matter. Easier than watching people lie to each other with smiles on their faces. Easier than being reminded that the world kept turning even after Catherine stopped being in it. The memories came without warning, the way they always did. April 12th, 1886. 3.5 years ago. The night that killed more than just Catherine and their son. The night that killed the man Sam had been trying to become. Catherine had gone into labor at dawn. By noon, Sam knew something was wrong. Catherine was strong, had always been healthy, but the pain was different this time. Wrong. By evening, she was screaming, her body trying to expel something that wouldn't come. By 11 at night, Sam was riding hell-bent for Hollow Creek, pushing his horse rein to the edge of collapse. The medical reality was simple. Breech presentation. Baby position feet first instead of head first. In 1886, this required a doctor's intervention. Manual version of the baby or forceps delivery. A home birth with breech meant 50% maternal mortality. Baby survival was maybe 30%. Sam knew this because Catherine had read him the statistics from her medical books. She'd worked as a nurse before they married. She understood what was happening to her body. 8 miles to Hollow Creek in darkness. Sam's hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. Catherine's screams echoing in his memory, even though he was miles away from the cabin now. The trail was rocky, dangerous, but speed mattered more than safety. If he could get the doctor back in time, maybe both Catherine and the baby could be saved. Dr. Joseph Bennett's house sat on the edge of town. Sam pounded on the door at midnight. The doctor opened it, swaying slightly, smelling of whiskey. "My wife," Sam gasped. "Breech birth. She's dying." "Samuel Fletcher," Bennett said slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. "Where's your money?" Sam pulled out everything he had, $4.23, every penny he owned. "I'll pay the rest," Sam said. "However long it takes, I'll work it off. I'll give you anything. Just come now, please." Bennett looked at the money in Sam's palm. Then he looked at Sam's face. Then he stepped back and started to close the door. $50, Bennett said. "Cash, up front, or I don't move from this doorstep. Those are my terms." Sam's world narrowed to a single point of desperate clarity. $50. He had $4.23. The gap was $45.77. It might as well have been $10,000. "She's dying," Sam said. "The baby." $50, Bennett repeated. "I'm not a charity. This is a business." Sam tried to think. The cabin, the land, together may be worth $200 total, but there was no way to convert real estate to cash at midnight in a mountain town that didn't have a bank. The nearest bank was 20 miles away. "I'll give you the deed to my property," Sam said. "It's worth more than $50. "Property deeds take weeks to process," Bennett said. "I need cash money now. $50 or nothing." Sam stood into the doorway looking at this man who held the power of life and death in his soft whiskey-stinking hands. A man who'd taken an oath to help people, who'd promised to preserve life, who was now pricing that life at exactly $50. "Please," Sam said. The word tasted like ash. Bennett closed the door. Sam heard the lock slide into place. The ride back took 2 hours. Sam pushed rein as hard as he dared, knowing that if the horse collapsed, they'd both die on the trail and Catherine would die alone. The cabin came into view just as the eastern sky started to lighten with false dawn. Inside, Catherine lay on their bed still. The baby still unborn, also still, both gone. Sam arrived exactly 9 minutes too late to hear his wife's last words, which a neighbor woman who'd heard the screaming whispered to him later. "Don't let bitterness make you cruel, Samuel. Promise me." Catherine had said this as she died. And Sam, who wasn't there to make that promise, who'd failed in every way a husband could fail, took the words and carved them into his memory like a gravestone inscription. He buried them together behind the cabin under the white oak tree Catherine had loved. No preacher. Sam couldn't stomach the hypocrisy of having a man of God speak over graves created by the indifference of men. He marked the graves with river stones and spoke no words at all. For 6 weeks after that, Sam didn't speak to another human being. For 3 years after that, he spoke only when absolutely necessary. The words had been used up. All the important things that needed saying had gone unsaid when they mattered. So what was the point of saying anything now? The memories faded. Sam found himself back on his porch, the afternoon sun high overhead. 3.5 years had passed, but the pain was still fresh as a new wound. Some things didn't heal. You just learned to carry them. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Sam went hunting. There was a 6-point buck that had been moving through his territory for the past week, and fresh venison would be welcome. He took the Sharp's rifle, checked that it was loaded, and moved into the forest with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to become part of the landscape. Tracking was meditation in motion, reading the signs, a broken twig here, a hoof print in soft earth there, the way grass bent, the scatter pattern of droppings. The buck had passed through maybe 20 minutes ago, moving slow, grazing, unaware that death was following its trail. Sam had tracked for 15 minutes when he heard the sound. Faint at first, a whimper. No, not quite a whimper. A human, female, coming from the direction of the Colburn property. He froze mid-step, his body going still the way prey goes still when sensing danger. Bears didn't sob, mountain lions didn't cry, wolves didn't weep. Only people made that sound. And in these mountains, people usually meant trouble. Sam's hand moved to the rifle, checking its position by instinct. His mind raced through possibilities. Lost traveler, injured woman. Traps set by bandits to lure good Samaritans. But the sound was wrong for deception. This was real desperation, the kind that came from prolonged suffering. He began moving toward the sound, each step placed carefully on bare rock or moss-covered ground. Years of hunting had taught him how to move like smoke, how to approach without being detected. The sobbing grew louder, definitely a woman's voice, weak and exhausted and terrified. At 50 yards out, Sam saw her through the trees. She was tied to a massive oak that had fallen years ago, its roots torn from the earth like the fingers of a giant clawing at the sky. The tree had been dead for maybe 5 years, brought down by a storm, and now it lay parallel to the ground with its root system exposed and massive. The woman was maybe 25, 27 years old. She wore a gray dress that had once been the habit of a nun, though it was torn and filthy now. Her hair was brown and cut short in the style of the religious sisters, but it was matted with sweat and dirt and leaves. Her belly was swollen, enormous with pregnancy. 7 months at least, Sam estimated. Maybe more. But it was the rope that stopped Sam cold. New hemp rope, golden yellow and thick, the expensive kind you bought at a lumberyard. Not old frayed line that farmers kept in barns. This was fresh, recently purchased, tied with the professional knots. The rope wound around her wrists and pulled them back against the exposed roots. More rope circled her waist, lashing her to the trunk. She wasn't hidden. She'd been placed here, positioned like a display. Through the trees, maybe 100 yards beyond the fallen oak, Sam could see the Colburn Ranch, the main house, the windmill that creaked as it turned, outbuildings. Close enough that this woman could probably hear the sounds of daily life happening just beyond her reach. Close enough that whoever had done this wanted her found, eventually. Sam approached slowly, removing his wide-brimmed hat so she could see his face clearly. The scar on his left cheek caught the afternoon light. He set the hat on a nearby stump and placed his canteen on the ground within her line of sight, but not pushing it toward her, giving her space, giving her the choice to trust or not trust. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from 2 weeks of silence, "I'm going to cut you loose." Her eyes, red from crying and maybe from days without real sleep, flickered toward him and then past him, searching the trees behind him as if expecting others. "Don't," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. "Please don't." Sam stopped. He'd expected relief, maybe tears of joy, maybe frantic begging to be freed. He had not expected her to tell him to leave her here. "You can't stay like this," he said quietly. "You'll die," she whispered. "If you help me, you'll die." In that moment, Sam understood. This wasn't just cruelty. This was theater. Someone had tied this woman to this tree in this specific location for a specific purpose. and that purpose involved punishing anyone who interfered. Since Catherine's death, Sam had lived with death as his only reliable companion. The idea of dying didn't frighten him much anymore. He'd been to war. He'd watched friends die at Antietam. He'd failed to save his wife and unborn son. Death was familiar territory. But the idea of walking away, of leaving this woman tied to a tree like an animal, of doing nothing while someone suffered when he had the power to help, that terrified him in a way bullets never had. That would make him into something he couldn't recognize in the mirror. That would make Catherine's last words meaningless. Don't let bitterness make you cruel. Sam knelt beside the fallen oak, his knees pressing into the rough bark, and pulled out his 8-inch Bowie knife. The woman's breath caught in fear. I'm just cutting the rope, Sam said quietly. Be still. He worked the blade under the rope at her wrists, sawing slowly so the fibers wouldn't snap back and hurt her when they gave way. The hemp was tough, new, and strong, and he had to put real effort into each cut. Whoever had tied her hadn't wanted her getting loose on her own. 3 minutes of careful sawing. Sam's hands were steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. His back was exposed to the trail, to anyone who might be watching from the ranch, to danger he couldn't see. But his focus stayed on the rope, on the cut, on this one simple act of defiance. When the rope finally gave way, her arms dropped heavily, like she'd forgotten how to control them. She gasped and curled inward, one hand going immediately to her swollen belly, the other hanging useless at her side. Sam leaned back, keeping his hands where she could see them, giving her space. He didn't touch her. He waited. That was when he noticed what bothered him most. Not the way she'd been tied, though, that was monstrous enough. But the rope itself. It was too new, too clean. The kind you bought in town and paid cash for. Someone had gone to a store, selected this specific rope, paid for it, brought it here, and used it for this specific purpose. This had been planned. Sam stood and looked at the ground around the tree. Boot prints circled it deep at the heels, pacing back and forth, like someone had waited here, watched, made sure their message was clear. He counted at least 3 different sets of prints, multiple men. They'd stood here smoking cigarettes. He could see the crushed butts on the ground. They'd made this a social occasion. One set of prints stood out. The left boot had a distinctive notch in the heel, a V-shaped gap, maybe half an inch deep, like the boot had been damaged or was poorly made, but distinctive, recognizable. Sam glanced toward the ranch house again. No movement, no sound except the slow creak of the windmill. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that came when people knew exactly what was happening and chose to look the other way. What's your name? Sam asked. The woman swallowed. Her throat looked raw, like she'd been screaming or crying or both. Grace, she said. Grace Whitfield. People called me Sister Grace. Wap nodded once, filing the information away. I'm Sam Fletcher. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the distant ranch house, as if expecting someone to come running at any moment. Sam took off his leather coat, the one he wore even in August, because mountain nights got cold, and laid it across the oak trunk near her, close enough that she could reach it if she wanted. She hesitated, then pulled it around her shoulders with her good hand. Her other arm still hung limp, circulation slowly returning after hours of being bound. Can you stand? Sam asked. Grace tried. She braced her good hand against the tree trunk and pushed. Her legs shook. She made it halfway to vertical before her knees buckled, and she collapsed back down, shaking her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. Sam didn't try to lift her, didn't make a show of strength or control. Instead, he turned and walked back through the trees to where he'd left Rain, his bay mare, ground-tied and patiently waiting. He brought the horse around slowly, letting Grace see him coming, giving her time to adjust to what was happening. He helped her mount by creating a step with his interlaced hands and boosting her up into the saddle. He turned his back while she settled herself sideways, accommodating her belly, giving her what dignity and privacy he could in an undignified situation. When he turned back around, she was gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity, her whole body trembling. As Sam tied his gear to the saddle, his fingers brushed against the cut rope still lying on the ground. He picked it up, examined it once more in the fading afternoon light, then deliberately left it there in plain sight. Message sent. Message received. Sam knew what he was doing. He was declaring himself, standing up, making himself a target. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of hay and horses from the Colburn property. Grace spoke suddenly, her voice flat and hollow with exhaustion. "He's my husband," she said. "Or he says he is, Ezekiel Colburn. He said the baby wasn't his. He said people needed to see. He said it would end the talk." Sam felt something cold settle in his chest. This hadn't been random violence or sudden rage. This had been calculated, a lesson, a warning, a demonstration of power. He climbed onto Rain in front of Grace, keeping space between them, and took the reins. The ranch behind them stayed silent, too silent. He glanced once more at the fallen tree, at the rope still lying there like evidence at a crime scene. If Colburn had wanted Grace found, Sam wondered what the man was planning to do once people started asking questions. The answer came immediately. Colburn didn't care about questions. He controlled the answers. Rain didn't pick up speed until the Colburn ranch fell out of sight behind the ridge. Even then, Sam kept the pace easy, letting the horse walk steady, the kind of pace you set when you don't want to draw attention or tire your mount. Grace sat behind him. Her breathing labored, one hand still pressed against her belly. They passed landmarks Sam knew well. A dry wash where water ran only in spring. A stretch of fence with posts leaning at various angles never repaired, because everybody knew whose land it was and nobody wanted to be the one to fix Colburn property uninvited. The Deacon's reach extended far into these hills. "Are you hungry?" Sam asked after a long silence. Grace nodded once, the movement barely perceptible. Sam reached into his saddlebag without stopping the horse and pulled out a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth and some dried venison. He handed it back to her, slowly making sure his movements were predictable. She took the food and ate like someone who'd been told for a long time not to take too much. Small bites. Careful, making it last. The cabin appeared as the sun started its descent behind the western peaks. Sam's place wasn't much to admire. A low structure built from hand-cut logs with a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind came from the north. The barn leaned slightly, but held. The corral fence had been patched more times than anyone could count. It wasn't welcoming, but it was quiet. It was hidden. It was safe. Sam helped Grace down from Rain without lifting her, just steadying her elbow until her feet found solid ground. She stood for a moment swaying, then followed him inside on unsteady legs. The cabin interior was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd stopped caring about impressions 3 years ago. Packed dirt floor, stone fireplace, rough wooden table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, shelves holding books and supplies, weapons visible everywhere, Winchester over the fireplace, Sharp's rifle by the door, Colt revolver on the table. Sam poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and set it on the table within Grace's reach. She drank it in 3 long swallows, then stopped breathing hard. "You're safe here," Sam said. "For tonight." "For tonight," Grace repeated, as if the idea of tomorrow was too much to consider. Sam nodded. "Night's all I'm offering right now." That seemed to settle her slightly. At least the terms were clear. No false promises, no obligations beyond sunrise. But underneath her exhaustion, Sam could sense something else. Not just fear. Tension. The kind that came from waiting for consequences to arrive. Grace spoke while Sam was washing his hands in the basin by the window. "He said it would be cleaner this way," she said to the wall of the room, to anyone who would listen. "He said if people saw me like that, tied up and helpless, they would understand." Sam didn't turn around. He let her talk. "Understand what?" he asked quietly. "That I was a problem," Grace said. "That I needed to be dealt with. That even a woman of God could fall so far that she deserved whatever came next." Sam dried his hands slowly on a rag, taking his time. Then he turned to look at her. She wasn't crying now. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. This was the kind of tired that came from having your reality questioned and twisted until you couldn't trust your own memory anymore. "Did he tie you himself?" Sam asked. Grace hesitated, then nodded. "He didn't rush," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what scared me most. He was calm, like he was tying up a horse, like I was just another piece of property that needed to be secured." Sam felt the rope again, metaphorically, like it was tightening around something behind his ribs. Outside, a tin can rattled against the fence post. Just once. Sam froze. The sound came again. Faint. Like a boot had brushed metal by accident. Sam moved to the window without hurrying, his hand resting on the sill. He looked out at the yard, the fence, the narrow trail beyond, that led down the mountain toward Hollow Creek. Nothing there, just evening shadows lengthening across familiar ground. But when Sam stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, he saw them. Fresh boot prints in the dirt near the gate, heavy at the heel, prints that hadn't been there that morning. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. Someone had left evidence of their presence deliberately. Sam didn't follow the prints. Instead, he went back inside and latched the door. Not slamming it, not making a show, just securing it the way a man does when he knows the game has started and the stakes are life and death. "Someone out there," Grace whispered. "Maybe," Sam said. "Maybe not." It wasn't comforting, but it was honest. He set his rifle by the door, not leaning it dramatically against the wall, just resting it where it belonged, where he could reach it in darkness if needed. They ate in silence, cold venison and the rest of the cornbread Sam had brought back. He laid out a blanket near the small bed in the corner and gestured for Grace to take it. He took the wooden chair by the opposite wall for himself, positioning it so he could see the door and the window both. He didn't explain, didn't make speeches about propriety or protection. He just stayed. Sometime after midnight, the sound came again, closer this time. A footstep, careful and measured, then the faint scrape of something against wood. Sam stood slowly, moving to the window without making the floorboards creak. In the moonlight, he could see it clearly. A length of rope hung over his fence post near the corral. New hemp rope, looped once then twice, like someone testing weight, like someone leaving a message. Sam went outside, his boots crunching softly on gravel. No one was visible in any direction. The rope swayed slightly in the night breeze, turning slowly on the post. He lifted it down, feeling the rough fibers against his palm. His jaw set hard. Same rope, same message. Whoever had done this wanted him to see, wanted him to know they could reach his property anytime they wanted. That distance and darkness provided no protection. That choosing to help Grace Whitfield meant choosing to be watched, followed, threatened. Sam cut the rope down and laid it flat on the ground, coiling it deliberately. When he turned back toward the cabin, Grace was standing in the doorway, her face pale in the lamplight. "They know where you live now," she said. It wasn't a question. Sam nodded. "And they know you saw," she added. "Yes." Grace swallowed hard. "What happens in the morning?" Sam looked out toward the road that led down to Hollow Creek, pale and winding in the moonlight, like a scar across the mountain's face. "In the morning," he said slowly, "we stop hiding." He didn't say the rest. Didn't explain that if Colburn was already writing his story out here in the dark, the deacon had probably already written the ending too. Men like Colburn didn't improvise. They planned. And they didn't start games they weren't certain they could win. Sam walked back inside, secured the door again, and returned to his chair. Grace climbed back onto the bed but didn't lie down. They sat like that for the rest of the night, two people who'd been alone for too long, suddenly forced into unwanted alliance by circumstances neither of them had chosen. Outside, the mountains held their silence. Inside, the fire burned low. And somewhere in the darkness between the cabin and the town, men were making plans for morning. The game had started the moment Sam cut that first rope. And in the morning, everyone would discover what Ezekiel Colburn did to people who challenged his authority. What he did to mountain men who thought they could save women he'd marked as lessons. What he did when someone forgot that in Hollow Creek, Colburn's word was law and Colburn's judgment was final. Morning would come whether they were ready or not. And with it would come the consequences of Sam's choice to stay to help, to refuse to become the kind of man who could walk away from suffering just because it wasn't his problem. Catherine's voice echoed in his memory one last time before sleep finally claimed him in that uncomfortable chair. "Don't let bitterness make you cruel, Samuel." He hadn't. That was something. That was enough. For now. Morning came hot and clear, the kind of August dawn that promised brutal heat by noon. Sam Fletcher was awake long before the sun cleared the eastern ridges. He'd learned decades ago that sleep came in fragments. When danger was close, your body's ancient instincts refusing to shut down completely when predators were circling. Grace was still on the bed, curled on her side with one hand protectively over her belly. She wasn't truly asleep either. Sam could tell by her breathing, too irregular, too conscious. They were both pretending rest while their minds raced through possibilities and consequences. Sam stood quietly and moved to the door. He opened it slowly, checking the perimeter the way he'd done every morning since 1862. Trees, trail, fence line, sky. Looking for anything out of place, any sign that visitors had returned during the night. What he found made his blood run cold. Against the base of a pine tree 30 yards from his cabin, a man sat slumped sideways, his body positioned in a way that living bodies don't position themselves. Even from this distance, Sam could see the dark stains spreading across the man's chest, could see the unnatural stillness that meant only one thing. Sam grabbed his Sharps rifle and moved across the clearing, each step measured rifle, ready to shoulder fire if this was a trap. But as he got closer, recognition hit him. Deputy William Barnes, young man maybe 32 who worked for the county. Sam had seen him in town a few times over the past 3 years, always trailing behind more senior lawmen, always looking like he wished he was somewhere else. Now Barnes was dying against a tree in Sam's clearing, and the somewhere else he'd be going was beyond any earthly jurisdiction. Fletcher, Barnes whispered when Sam knelt beside him. The deputy's eyes were glassy, unfocused. Knew you'd check perimeter. Waited. The wound was bad. Chest shot right side, probably punctured lung. Blood bubbled at the corner of Barnes's mouth. Sam had seen enough dying men to know this one had minutes, not hours. Who shot you? Sam asked, his voice low and steady. Reed's man. Barnes gasped. Fletcher. Not the mountain man, the other Fletcher. Works for Jackson Reed. I wouldn't torch your cabin. Refused. Said I was unreliable. Sam's jaw tightened. Jackson Reed was a bounty hunter and hired gun who worked for whoever paid best. If Colburn had brought Reed into this, the stakes had just escalated beyond local politics into professional violence. Barnes's hand fumbled inside his coat fingers, searching for something. Sam helped him, reaching into the deputy's jacket carefully, and pulled out a small leather journal. Maybe 40 or 50 pages bound with a leather strap, the kind of book someone might use for daily notes or accounts. Found it, Barnes whispered, blood flecking his lips. In Colburn's study. Was supposed to burn it, but I kept it. Give it to Sheriff Clayton. Tell him some of us tried. The journal fell from Barnes's fingers into Sam's hands. Sam opened it to a random page and saw handwriting he didn't recognize. Neat script, feminine dated entries going back weeks. It's hers, Barnes said, reading Sam's confusion. The woman, Grace, her diary from when she was at Colburn's house. Proof she never wanted to be there. Proof of everything. Sam felt the weight of the journal in his hands, understanding immediately what this meant. Grace's own words. Contemporary documentation. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed as faulty memory or vindictive lies. There were others, Barnes continued, his voice fading. Before her, women who disappeared. Check Colburn's property ledgers. Sales from 86, 87. He's done this before. Martha Cole was first, then others. Pattern. Barnes coughed a wet, rattling sound. His eyes lost focus, then found Sam's face one more time. Tell Clayton, he whispered. Some of us chose right at the end. Then he was gone. Just like that. One moment a man with regrets and redemption on his mind, the next moment just a body that needed burying. Sam sat back on his heels, the journal still in his hands. William Barnes had died trying to do the right thing. Had died because he'd finally found the courage to say no to men who'd owned his conscience for too long. The deputy's badge was still pinned to his chest, reflecting the rising sun. Sam stood and looked back at the cabin. Grace was in the doorway now, wrapped in a blanket, watching. She saw the body, saw the journal in Sam's hands, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite hope, but recognition that maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely alone in this. We need to bury him, Sam said. Grace nodded. I'll help. You shouldn't, the baby. I'm a nurse, Grace said quietly. I've seen his death before, and Deputy Barnes died helping us. The least I can do is witness his burial. They buried William Barnes in an unmarked grave at the edge of Sam's property, under a stand of white pine where the ground was soft enough to dig. Sam didn't know any prayers that felt appropriate. He'd stopped believing God listened to mountain hermits 3 years ago. So he just stood there with his hat in his hands while Grace whispered something in Latin words from her years as a nun, words that sounded like they might actually mean something to whatever waited on the other side. After filling in the grave, Sam went back to the body's original position and studied the ground. Boot prints, multiple sets. Barnes hadn't come here alone. He'd been followed, shot, and left here as a message. But the killers hadn't stayed to make sure Sam found the body. They'd left before dawn, probably figuring Barnes would be dead long before anyone discovered him. They hadn't counted on Barnes's stubborn determination to survive just long enough to pass on what he knew. Back in the cabin, Sam opened the journal properly and began reading. Grace sat across from him, watching his face as he absorbed her words. The entries started 3 weeks ago, dated June 1st, the day Grace had signed marriage papers with Ezekiel Colburn. Day 1, he told me tonight what this marriage really means. I am not his wife, I am his lesson, his demonstration. He explained it very calmly, almost kindly, the way you might explain rules to a child. I wanted to run, but there is nowhere to run to. I wanted to scream, but who would hear me? Day 3. He controls everything. What I eat, how much water I drink, where I can walk in this house. The doors are locked from outside, windows nailed shut. He says it is for my own good, for the baby's safety. I think he enjoys the control more than anything else. Day 7, a woman came today, Martha Hayes from the general store. Colburn sent her away without letting me see her. I heard her voice asking about me, heard him tell her I was resting, needed privacy. She left. Nobody questions him. Day 12, he said if I try to leave, he will find the baby after it is born and correct it. I do not know what that means. I do not want to know. The threat is enough. I am trapped, not by walls, but by the life growing inside me. Day 19, Dr. Bennett came. Colburn was in the room the entire time. The doctor examined me, said the baby's healthy, said I seemed tired, but that is normal for pregnancy. He did not ask why I have bruises on my wrists. He did not ask why I flinch when Colburn moved suddenly. He looked at the bruises and said nothing. Day 21 today, Colburn told me about his plan. He said people are talking, questioning his authority, wondering why no one ever sees his new wife. So he is going to show them. Show them what happens when someone becomes a problem. Show them that even a woman of God can be reduced to nothing if she forgets her place. I am to be his object lesson, his proof of power. Sam closed the journal, his hands shaking slightly with controlled rage. This wasn't just abuse. This was calculated psychological torture documented in the victim's own handwriting. Any judge who read this would understand exactly what Colburn was. He took this from you, Sam asked. Grace nodded. After the first week, said I didn't need to write it anymore. Said my story was his to tell now. How did Barnes get it? I don't know. I didn't even know it still existed. I thought Colburn had burned it. Sam stood and walked to the window, looking out at the trail that led toward Hollow Creek. The sun was higher now, heat already building. In town, people would be starting their day, opening shops, beginning work, living normal lives, while out here in the mountains, a deputy lay in an unmarked grave and a journal full of horrors sat on a rough wooden table. We're going to town, Sam said, not looking at Grace. She stiffened. He could hear it in the sudden silence, the way her breathing changed. To the doctor, she asked. To everyone, Sam said, turning to face her. We're going to build a case, gather evidence, put ourselves where people can see us, where Colburn has to be careful about what he does. If he wants a fight, he can have it in daylight with witnesses. Grace nodded slowly, though her hands trembled against the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. We need to leave now, Sam continued, before Reed and his men come back, before Colburn decides sending messages isn't enough. They prepared quickly. Sam saddled Rain and hitched the horse to his wagon, the one he used maybe twice a year for supply runs. Grace gathered what little she had, which amounted to Sam's coat and her torn gray dress. Sam loaded his weapons, all of them. Sharp's rifle, Winchester, Colt revolver, and Catherine's old Smith & Wesson .32 caliber, which he wrapped in cloth and placed in the wagon within Grace's reach. The wagon rolled out with the sun climbing toward 10 o'clock, dust puffing up behind them in soft bursts. Neither of them looked back toward the cabin, but both felt it there like a weight on their shoulders. Home, sanctuary, the place they might never see again if this went wrong. The road down the mountain was rutted and steep, requiring Sam's full attention to navigate. Rain pulled steadily, her hooves finding purchase on loose stone. The wagon creaked and swayed. Grace sat beside Sam, one hand braced against the seat, the other on her belly. They didn't talk. There wasn't much to say. They both knew what they were riding into. A town controlled by the man who'd tied Grace to a tree. A legal system that served wealth and power before justice. A community that had learned to look away because looking was dangerous. But they also had Barnes's journal, and they had the truth. And sometimes Sam thought that had to be enough. Because if it wasn't enough, then nothing mattered, and men like Colburn had already won before the fight even started. Hollow Creek appeared in the valley below them, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single main street. The town had maybe 300 permanent residents, another 100 who came and went with seasonal work at Colburn's lumber mill. Church steeple rising at the north end, general store, telegraph office, saloon, blacksmith, doctor's office, all the pieces of civilization arranged in their proper places looking peaceful and normal from a distance. They reached the edge of town just before noon. Sam pulled the wagon up near the livery stable and helped Grace down his movements, steady and careful. People were beginning to emerge from buildings, now drawn by the unusual sight of Sam Fletcher in town for the first time in weeks, and with a woman they didn't recognize. Eyes followed them, not staring exactly, but noticing. The kind of noticing that meant gossip would start circulating before they'd taken 10 steps. "I need to send a message first," Sam said quietly. "Then we see about gathering proof." The telegraph office sat on the corner of Main Street, a small wooden building that smelled of ink and hot metal when they entered. Behind the counter sat Robert Miller, an old man of maybe 64 with nervous eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he set down the telegram he'd been transcribing. "Samuel Fletcher," Miller said, his voice uncertain. "Haven't seen you in town for a while." "Need to send a wire," Sam said, sliding coins across the counter. Miller glanced at Grace, then quickly away. "Where to?" "Sheriff Marcus Clayton, county seat." Miller's hand paused over his telegraph key. "Sheriff Clayton, is there trouble?" "That depends on who you ask," Sam said. "But I'd appreciate the message going through quickly." Sam kept his words simple and direct, knowing that anything he sent would likely be seen by other eyes before it reached Clayton. Just names and a location. Nothing that could be misunderstood or twisted. "Need your help. Stop Hollow Creek. Stop Sam Fletcher." Miller tapped out the message, the clicks echoing in the small office. When he finished, he looked at Sam with something between sympathy and fear. "Mr. Fletcher," Miller said quietly, "I don't know what this is about, but Deacon Colburn he's an important man in this town." "I know who he is," Sam said. "Just be careful, that's all I'm saying." Sam was about to leave when Miller cleared his throat. "There's something else," the old man said, reaching under his counter. "Something you should probably know about." He pulled out several pieces of paper, carbon copies of telegrams. His hands shook as he laid them out on the counter. "2 weeks ago, I got a telegram from Baltimore, from a convent, Sisters of Charity. They were asking about a woman named Grace Whitfield. Wanted to know if she was safe, if she was happy, if she needed help." Grace made a small sound beside Sam, quickly stifled. Miller continued, not looking at her. "Deacon Colburn came in that same day. Sent a telegram back to Baltimore in response. Told them Sister Grace had voluntarily left. The order had married and wished no further contact." He pushed another carbon copy forward. "Then I got 2 more telegrams from Baltimore over the next week. More concerned, asking for confirmation, wanting to speak with Sister Grace directly. And Deacon Colburn paid me $50 cash to tell them I'd never heard of any Grace Whitfield, to say no such person existed in Hollow Creek." The silence in the telegraph office was absolute. Even the usual street sounds from outside seemed to have faded away. "Why are you telling me this?" Sam asked. Miller looked at Grace, really looked at her this time. "Because my daughter ran away from a bad marriage 5 years ago. Went to Baltimore, actually trying to start over. The Sisters of Charity took her in, gave her work, gave her hope. If someone had tried to find her, tried to make sure she was safe, and I'd lied about it." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I can't carry that weight. Not for $50, not for 50,000. "You kept the carbon copies," Sam observed. "I keep copies of everything," Miller said. "Learned that lesson the hard way in this business. Never know when someone will try to claim a telegram was never sent." "This is evidence," Sam said. "Evidence that Colburn deliberately cut Grace off from anyone who might help her." "I know," Miller said. "And if this goes to trial, if Sheriff Clayton asks me to testify, I will. But you should know what that means for me. Colburn owns this building, owns the lot it sits on. He can evict me anytime he wants, can destroy my business with a word." Yet you're willing to testify. Miller straightened slightly, some steel entering his posture. My daughter wrote me a letter last year, said the sisters taught her something important. Said sometimes you have to do what's right even when it costs you everything. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I think I'm starting to understand now. Sam carefully folded the carbon copies and put them in his coat pocket. Thank you, he said simply. They left the telegraph office and walked down Main Street toward the general store. The midday heat was oppressive now, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned wooden sidewalks hot enough to burn through boot leather. Martha Hayes's general store sat at the center of town, a well-maintained building with clean windows and an organized interior that spoke of careful management. Martha herself stood behind the counter, a woman of 62 with iron gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She looked up when Sam and Grace entered, and her expression shifted immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. Sister Grace, Martha said quietly, I've been worried about you. Grace seemed startled that someone remembered her, that someone cared enough to worry. Mrs. Hayes, Grace said, I'm sorry I couldn't when you came to the house. Don't apologize, Martha said firmly. I know who kept you from that door. I know who sent me away. She looked at Sam. Samuel Fletcher. Haven't seen you in town since your wife passed. I'm sorry for your loss. Sam nodded acknowledgement. People in small towns remembered your tragedies, kept them cataloged like library books. I heard what happened, Martha continued. Heard Deacon Colburn's version of things anyway. That Sister Grace ran away from her lawful husband and you helped her do it. That's not what happened, Grace said quietly. I didn't think so, Martha replied. My daughter married a man like Colburn once. Different name, same poison. He was all Bible verses and charity in public. In private, she stopped, her hands gripping the counter. He killed her, not with a gun or a knife, with his fists and his words and his need to control everything. She finally got the courage to leave him. He found her 3 days later, beat her so badly she never recovered. She died in my arms a month later. The pain in Martha's voice was raw despite the years that had passed. Some wounds didn't heal. You just learned to function around them. I won't watch another woman go through what my Sarah did, Martha said. What do you need? Records, Sam said, of purchases, specifically rope. Martha's expression darkened. That weasel Robert Yates came by 2 days ago, county clerk, said he needed to check my inventory for tax purposes. While he was here, he tore a page out of my ledger. The page that showed Deacon Colburn buying 50 feet of new hemp rope 3 days before Sister Grace was found tied to that tree. He destroyed evidence, Sam said. He tried to, Martha corrected. She reached under his counter and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a camera, old but functional, the kind that used glass plate negatives. I started photographing my ledger pages a year ago, after Colburn tried to claim I'd overcharged him and I couldn't prove otherwise. Now I have proof of every transaction. She pulled out a glass plate and held it up to the light coming through the window. Even in negative, the entry was clearly readable. Hemp rope 50 feet sold to E. Colburn, cash payment $4.70. This photograph proves Colburn bought the rope, Sam said, feeling something like hope stirring. Bought it new, paid cash 3 days before Grace was found. And it proves Yates tried to destroy the evidence, Martha added, which means they both knew what that rope was going to be used for. Will you testify if this goes to trial? Sam asked. Martha's smile was grim. I'll testify. Colburn already hates me for being an independent woman who doesn't bow and scrape. Can't make it much worse than it already is. Besides, I'm old. What's he going to do, evict a 62-year-old widow? Let him try. People in this town might finally see him for what he really is. Sam carefully placed the glass plate negative in his coat pocket with Miller's telegram copies. 2 pieces of evidence now. 2 people willing to stand up. As they left the general store, Martha caught Grace's hand. You're stronger than you know, she said quietly. Surviving what you survived takes steel. Don't let anyone tell you different. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Their next stop was the livery stable where a teenage boy named Henry Cooper was mucking out stalls. He was maybe 14, all knees and elbows, with blonde hair that stuck up at odd angles. He stopped working when he saw Sam approach, his eyes going wide. Mr. Fletcher, Henry said nervously, I didn't mean to cause trouble with that note I left you. You didn't cause trouble, Sam said. You helped. But I need to know more. You said Colburn bought rope. Did you see him do it? Henry nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I was at the lumberyard next door delivering feed. I heard him talking to Mr. Patterson. He bought a coil of rope but told Patterson not to put it on his account. Said he'd pay cash and didn't want a record. Why would someone do that? Sam asked, though he already knew. Because he was planning something he didn't want folks knowing about, Henry said. The boy was smarter than his years suggested. You also mentioned his boots, Sam prompted. Yes, sir. The left one has a chunk missing from the heel like someone took a bite out of it. Leaves a real distinctive print. Henry led them around to the back of the livery where the ground was still soft from a recent rain. There, clear as ink on paper, was a boot print with a distinctive V-shaped notch in the left heel. Same print was all around that tree where they found Sister Grace, Henry said. I went and looked after I heard about it, wanted to see for myself. Sam knelt and studied the print. This was physical evidence, not just testimony or documents, but something that could be measured, compared, proven. If Colburn's boot matched this print, it placed him at the scene. Henry, Sam said carefully, would you be willing to testify to what you saw in front of a judge? The boy paled slightly. Will Deacon Colburn be there? Yes. Will he be able to hurt me afterward? Sam wanted to lie to promise safety, but he had too much respect for the boy to do that. I don't know, he said honestly, but Sheriff Clayton will be there, and so will I. We'll do everything we can to protect you and your family. Henry thought about it for a long moment. Then he straightened his shoulders in a way that made him look older than 14. My sister died 3 years ago, Henry said quietly. She was married to a man who beat her. Nobody helped her because everyone was scared of him. He was connected, important. She died alone. I won't let that happen to someone else if I can stop it. I'll testify. Sam felt something crack in his chest, some cynical certainty that people only looked out for themselves. Here was a boy willing to risk everything because his sister hadn't been saved, and he couldn't bear to watch history repeat. They left the livery stable with Henry's promise and headed toward their final stop. Dr. Joseph Bennett's office sat at the edge of town, a small wooden building that smelled of carbolic acid and desperation. Sam stood outside the door for a long moment before knocking. The last time he'd been here was the night Catherine died. The night Bennett demanded $50 Sam didn't have. The night that divided Sam's life into before and after. The door opened. Dr. Bennett stood there, 61 years old, with a thick gray beard and hands that trembled. Not from age, from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer. Samuel Fletcher, Bennett said, his voice hoarse. I wondered if you'd come. Need to talk, Sam said. Bennett stepped aside to let them enter. His office was cluttered, but clean medical instruments arranged on trays, bottles of various tinctures lining shelves. The smell of alcohol was strong, and not just the medical kind. You examined Grace 2 days ago, Sam said without preamble. What did you find? Bennett looked at Grace, then away quickly, guilt written all over his face. A woman in her 7th month of pregnancy, he said, baby healthy, mother showing stress and malnutrition, but nothing immediately life-threatening. And the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises. Bennett sat down heavily in his desk chair. I saw them. Did you ask about them? No. Why not? The silence stretched. Bennett poured himself a drink from the bottle in his desk, his hands shaking so badly he spilled some on the wood. Because I'm a coward, he finally said. Because I knew what those marks meant, and I was too afraid to acknowledge them. Because Deacon Colburn was standing right there in the room, watching, waiting to see if I'd say something. And I said nothing. Sam felt the old rage rising, the fury he'd carried for 3 years. This man had let Catherine die. This man had chosen money over life. And now he was admitting he'd done it again with Grace. There's more, Bennett said, his voice breaking. 2 years ago, Martha Cole. You remember her? Sam shook his head. Farmer's wife, rented land from Colburn. She got pneumonia. I knew she needed medicine, maybe $40 worth. I went to Colburn, asked if he could extend credit to the Coles so they could afford treatment. Bennett took another drink. He refused, said they needed to learn fiscal responsibility, said he couldn't enable poor financial choices. Martha Cole died 3 days later. Simple infection that could have been cured with $20 of medicine. 3 months after that, Colburn foreclosed on their farm. And you, Sam asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Colburn paid me $200 to keep quiet about the fact that he could have saved her life and chose not to. I took the money. God help me, I took the money. Grace was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face. Bennett looked at her, and something in him seemed to break completely. I let Martha Cole die because I was a coward, he said. I let you suffer, Sister Grace, because I was a coward. I let Samuel's wife die because I was a coward. But I can't carry this anymore. I can't live with another death on my conscience. He pulled open his desk drawer and took out a small notebook. There were others, Bennett said. Women Colburn used his charity to control. Women who disappeared or detained or fled in the night. I kept notes, dates, names. Anna Wright in 1886, Rebecca Ford in 1887, Martha Cole in 1887. Others I only suspected but couldn't prove. He handed the notebook to Sam. If this goes to trial, if you need me to testify, I will. I'll tell them everything. What Colburn did, what I did. Maybe it won't save on my soul, but maybe it'll save someone else. Sam took the notebook, added it to the growing collection of evidence in his coat pockets. They left Bennett sitting at his desk, staring at his trembling hands, a man trying too late to find redemption. Outside, the afternoon sun was brutal. Sam and Grace walked back toward the wagon in silence, both of them processing what they'd learned. The pattern was clear now. Colburn found vulnerable women, offered salvation, then used that salvation as a weapon. And people like Bennett and Yates and others enabled it through silence and cowardice. They were almost to the wagon when Sam heard horses. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace down Main Street. He turned and saw Sheriff Marcus Clayton riding at the head of a small group, his badge catching the sunlight. Clayton was 55, black, lean, and weathered with gray hair, and the kind of face that had seen too much but refused to look away. He'd been the first black man elected sheriff in this part of West Virginia back during Reconstruction, and he'd held on to the position through competence, courage, and careful political navigation. He dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in Sam's defensive posture, the rifle in the wagon, the tension in both Sam and Grace's faces. Got your telegram, Clayton said simply. Rode through the night to get here. Figured if Sam Fletcher was asking for help, things were bad. Sam clasped hands with the sheriff, the grip of men who'd shared trenches and knew what it meant to trust someone with your life. They're bad, Sam confirmed. Clayton looked at Grace, really looked at her with a lawman's eye that took in the torn dress, the exhausted posture, the protective hand on her belly, the rope burns on her wrists that were still visible. Ma'am, he said formally, touching his hat brim, I'm Sheriff Marcus Clayton. Would you like to tell me what happened? Grace told him. Not everything, but enough. The assault by Reverend Cross, the forced marriage to Colburn, the 3 weeks of control, being tied to the tree, Sam rescuing her. Clayton listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Grace finished, he turned to Sam. You have evidence. Sam pulled out everything. Miller's telegram copies, Martha's photograph, Bennett's notebook, Barnes's journal, which he'd kept separate, wrapped in cloth. Deputy Barnes dies this morning, Sam said quietly. Shot by one of Jackson Reed's men. He gave me this before he died. Grace's diary from her time at Colburn's house. Her own words documenting everything. Clayton took the journal, opened it carefully, and began reading. His jaw tightened with each page. This is bigger than I thought, he finally said. This isn't just about one woman. This is about Colburn showing he's above the law, that he can do anything to anyone and no one can stop him. Can we stop him? Grace asked. The question hung in the afternoon air. Clayton was quiet for a long moment, weighing options, calculating odds. We need a jury trial, he said, not just a judge's order. A full trial with 12 citizens of Hollow Creek deciding the verdict. Because one judge can be bought or intimidated. But 12 ordinary people shown the truth, forced to make a choice in public, that's harder to corrupt. Can you get that? Sam asked. Under West Virginia law, when criminal charges are filed involving assault, unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, both sides have the right to jury trial. I've already got a petition signed by 22 citizens requesting exactly that. Judge Crane can't refuse without creating appealable error and attracting attention from the state capitol. Sam felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but possibility. So what happens now? Grace asked. Now we prepare, Clayton said. Trial's set for tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Colburn's bringing in a fancy lawyer from Charleston, man named Harrison Webb. He'll be smooth, expensive, and ruthless. But we have something he doesn't have. What's that? Sam asked. The truth, Clayton said simply, and people who are willing to stand up and speak it. They spent the rest of the afternoon at Clayton's temporary office going over evidence, preparing testimony, building a strategy. Miller would testify about the telegrams, Martha about the rope purchase and Yates destroying evidence, Henry about witnessing the transaction and the boot print, Bennett about the pattern of abuse and previous victims, and Grace would testify about everything: the assault, the forced marriage, the imprisonment, being tied to the tree, all of it. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains gold and purple, they made their way back to Sam's cabin. Clayton rode with them, his presence both protection and commitment. They would face tomorrow together. At the cabin, they prepared for what was coming. Clayton reviewed Barnes's journal again, building a timeline. Sam cleaned his weapons, even though they were already clean, the ritual calming his nerves. Grace practiced her testimony, Clayton asking the hard questions a hostile lawyer would ask, helping her stay steady under pressure. Late in the evening, Sam found himself on the porch with Clayton, both men looking out at the darkness. You know this could go wrong, Clayton said quietly. Colburn has power, money, influence. Webb is one of the best lawyers in the state. Even with all our evidence, a jury might still side with a respected deacon over a mountain hermit and a nun who got pregnant. I know, Sam said. If we lose, Colburn will come after everyone who testified. Miller will lose his business. Martha will be harassed. Henry's family will suffer. And you and Grace? Clayton trailed off. I know, Sam repeated. So why do it? Why not take Grace and run? Get her somewhere safe, somewhere Colburn's influence doesn't reach. Sam was quiet for a long time, thinking about Catherine, about Barnes dying against a tree, about Henry Cooper's dead sister, about all the women in Bennett's notebook who'd suffered because good people chose safety over justice. Because if we run, Colburn wins, Sam finally said. And he'll do this again, to someone else. And the pattern continues. Someone has to stand up. Someone has to say no. Might as well be us. Clayton nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. That's why I came. Inside the cabin, Grace was reading the journal Barnes had died bringing them, her own words from weeks of captivity. When she looked up and saw Sam and Clayton watching her from the doorway, as she spoke. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said. Thank you, both of you, for not walking away, for treating me like I matter, for believing my story when so many others didn't. Your story deserves to be believed, Clayton said simply. They settled in for the night, taking turns on watch, no one really sleeping. Outside in the darkness, somewhere between the cabin and the town, men were making final preparations. Colburn plotting with his expensive lawyer. Reed and his hired guns waiting for orders. Yates and others preparing to lie under oath if needed. But inside the cabin, 3 people sat with truth and evidence and determination. Tomorrow would tell which was stronger, power or justice, wealth or courage the way things had always been, or the possibility that things could change. Sam cleaned his rifle one more time, the familiar motion steadying his hands. He thought about the woman tied to a tree, about the rope that had bound her, about the choice to cut that rope, even though every rational thought said to walk away. He'd made his choice. Tomorrow they'd all discover what that choice cost. The morning of the trial arrived with a heaviness that seemed to press down on the very mountains themselves. Sam Fletcher had been awake since well before dawn, his body running on the kind of exhausted alertness he remembered from the war. The kind that made your vision sharp and your reflexes fast, but it left your soul feeling hollow. He sat at his rough wooden table, surrounded by the documents that represented their only real hope. The photograph of Martha's ledger page showing Colburn's rope purchase. The telegram copies from Miller's office proving deliberate isolation. Dr. Bennett's shaky notebook documenting a pattern spanning years. Deputy Barnes's journal containing Grace's own words from her captivity. Each piece was precious, potentially not enough to overcome wealth and influence, but all they had. Coffee sat untouched beside him, long since gone cold. His calloused hands moved over the papers again and again, as if repetition could somehow strengthen their power. Grace emerged from behind the sleeping curtain, moving slowly with one hand supporting her swollen belly. She wore a clean gray dress that Martha Hayes had brought the day before, simple and modest, designed to present her as what she was. A woman of faith who had been wronged, not some wild creature fleeing her obligations. Her hair had been washed and braided neatly back. The small silver cross she still wore hung at her throat, catching the pale morning light filtering through the cabin windows. Her face was composed, showing none of the terror Sam knew she must be feeling. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. Sam looked up at her, this woman who had survived horrors that would have destroyed most people. He wanted to promise her that everything would be fine, that justice would prevail because it had to. But he had seen too much of the world to believe in fairy tales. "No," he said honestly, "but we're going anyway." The sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Sam moved to the window, hand instinctively touching the rifle against the wall. But it was Sheriff Clayton, as expected, riding alongside a wagon, specially prepared for the journey. The wagon bed had been fitted with blankets and cushions to make the 2-hour trip as comfortable as possible for a woman 7 months pregnant. Clayton dismounted with practiced ease, his sheriff's badge polished to a mirror shine for the occasion. At 55, he was lean and weathered with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much but still held on to something like hope. "Morning," he said, touching his hat brim. "Everything ready?" "As ready as it's going to be," Sam replied, helping Grace into her coat. "Judge Crane rode in last night looking sour as vinegar." Clayton said, his expression troubled. "Colburn's got himself a fancy lawyer from Charleston, fellow named Harrison Webb. Man's got a reputation for getting wealthy clients out of anything. He's expensive, smart, and ruthless." "And our witnesses?" Sam asked. "Martha Hayes will be there with fire in her belly. Henry Cooper is scared half to death but determined. Miller from the telegraph office promised to testify if called, though he's sweating bullets. And Dr. Bennett has been drinking heavy, but swears he'll be there and tell the truth." Sam nodded slowly, accepting this reality. They would go to battle with the army. They had not the army they wished for. They loaded Grace into the wagon and began the descent toward Hollow Creek. With every mile, Sam felt the weight of what was coming settling heavier on his shoulders. They were not just facing Colburn in a courtroom. They were facing an entire system built to protect men like him. As they approached town, Sam could see that word had spread like wildfire. People lined the streets in numbers he had never seen before. Some faces were openly hostile, already convinced of Sam's guilt. Others looked wide curious, waiting to pick the winning side. And a few showed something that might have been hope or perhaps just exhaustion with the way things had always been. The courthouse sat at the center of town, a 2-story wooden building with peeling white paint. People were already crowding inside, filling benches and standing along the walls. The air was thick with body heat and nervous energy, and the particular tension that comes when a community is forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. Inside, Judge Joseph Crane sat behind the makeshift bench, a man of 58 with a round face flushed red from heat or discomfort. He wore judicial robes over what Sam suspected was an expensive suit, and his expression suggested deep resentment at having his comfortable routine disrupted. To the right sat Ezekiel Colburn. Today he radiated respectability. Expensive suit pressed to perfection, every hair in place, a leather-bound Bible positioned prominently on the table before him. He looked like a man attending a church social, not a criminal trial. That calculated calm made Sam's jaw tighten. Beside Colburn sat Harrison Webb, and the lawyer was everything money could buy. 51 years old with distinguished silver hair, sharp gray eyes, and clothing that screamed wealth and power. His leather briefcase sat open before him, documents arranged in neat stacks, everything organized and intimidating. At the defense table sat Sam Grace and Sheriff Clayton. No fancy lawyer, no impressive credentials, just 3 people, and evidence they desperately hoped would be enough. The gallery was packed beyond capacity. Martha Hayes sat in front, her iron gray hair pulled back, her face set with determination. Beside her sat several other women who shared a common look, women who had endured enough and were ready to stand up. Young Henry Cooper near the back looked terrified but stayed in his seat. Dr. Bennett sat isolated to one side, looking 10 years older than his age but present. Judge Crane banged his gavel, 3 times sharp cracks that echoed like gunshots. "This court is now in session," Crane announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. We are here to address the complaint filed by Deacon Ezekiel Colburn against Samuel Fletcher, alleging abduction and interference with a lawful marriage, and the counter petition filed by Sheriff Elijah Clayton, alleging unlawful imprisonment, assault, and conspiracy. He shuffled papers deliberately, making everyone wait, establishing who was in control. Before we begin, I want certain things clear. This is a court of law, not a town meeting. Order will be maintained at all times. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed and held in contempt. Is that understood? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gallery. Very well. Mr. Webb, you may present your opening statement. Harrison Webb stood slowly, buttoning his expensive jacket, with movements refined through thousands of courtroom appearances. He walked to the center of the room with absolute confidence, positioning himself where everyone could see him. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of Hollow Creek, Webb began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. This case is remarkably simple, not complicated by obscure legal theories. Just simple, straightforward facts that any reasonable person can understand. He paused, letting his opening settle over the room. My client, Deacon Ezekiel Colburn, is a pillar of this community. I don't believe anyone here would seriously dispute that. He built a church where many of you worship every Sunday. He operates the lumber mill that provides employment to 24 men and their families. He has extended credit to struggling families when banks turn them away. He has been the backbone that has allowed Hollow Creek to survive and thrive. Webb began walking slowly along the gallery, making eye contact, drawing people into his narrative. 6 weeks ago, Deacon Colburn performed what I can only describe as an extraordinary act of Christian charity. Sister Grace Whitfield, a nun from Baltimore, found herself in extremely difficult circumstances. She was with child and abandoned by the man responsible, facing excommunication from her order and complete destitution. No family to turn to, no means of support, no prospects. Sam felt Grace tense beside him, but she kept her face carefully composed. Deacon Colburn could have turned away, Webb continued. Many men would have. But moved by his deep Christian faith and genuine compassion, he made a different choice. He offered Sister Grace his name, his home, his protection, his willingness to raise another man's child as his own. He asked nothing in return except that she honor the vows they would make before God and this community. Webb returned to his table and picked up a document, holding it high. This is their marriage certificate, properly signed by both parties. Witnessed by Robert Miller, our county clerk, bearing the seal of the Sisters of Charity in Baltimore. Countersigned by Justice Hartwell of this county. This is not some hasty, questionable arrangement. This is a legal binding marriage in every sense. He set the document down and turned to face Grace directly, his expression carefully crafted to show sympathy mixed with disappointment. But Mrs. Colburn, perhaps overwhelmed by her difficulties, perhaps influenced by well-meaning but misguided voices, chose to flee from her husband's home. She chose to break the sacred vows she had made. And Mr. Samuel Fletcher, rather than encouraging her to return and honor her commitments, rather than seeking reconciliation, chose to harbor her, to hide her, to keep her from the man she had promised before God to obey. Webb's voice grew harder, more accusatory. That is not charity. That is not Christian kindness. That is abduction. That is interference with a legal marriage. That is one man deciding his judgment matters more than the law, more than the church, more than the bonds of holy matrimony. That is why we are here seeking justice and asking that Mrs. Colburn be returned to her rightful place as Deacon Colburn's lawfully wedded wife. Webb returned to his seat, looking thoroughly satisfied. Around the courtroom, Sam could see people nodding, already convinced. It had been a good argument, clean and logical, built on documents and social expectations. Judge Crane turned to their table. Sheriff Clayton, I understand you're representing Mr. Fletcher and serving as advocate for Miss Whitfield. Do you wish to make an opening statement? Clayton rose to his feet, taking his time. He didn't have Webb's polish or expensive education, but he had truth and 30 years of mountain justice behind him. Your Honor, Clayton began, his voice clear and strong. Mr. Webb is right about one thing. This case is simple, but not in the way he claims. The simple truth here is that Sister Grace was never a willing wife. She was a prisoner, a victim, and Mr. Fletcher didn't abduct her. He rescued her from a situation that would have killed her and her unborn child. Clayton walked to where Grace sat and stood beside her chair, positioning himself as her protector. 3 days ago, Mr. Fletcher was hunting in the mountains when he heard crying. He followed that sound and found this woman tied to a fallen tree on Colburn property. Not resting, not sitting in contemplation, bound with new rope, her hands secured, her body lashed to that trunk like an animal on display. The crowd stirred. This was new information for many. She was left there in the August sun with barely enough waters to survive close enough to the Colburn ranch that she could see the buildings and hear the windmill, but too far for anyone passing by to hear her cries for help. That is not how a husband treats a wife. That is torture. A deliberate demonstration of power by a man who wanted everyone to know he could do whatever he wanted and no one would stop him. Clayton turned to face Colburn directly. And when Mr. Fletcher cut her loose and brought her to safety, Deacon Colburn didn't come looking with concern and care. He sent hired men in the night, multiple attempts to take her by force. He's been using every ounce of his considerable power to get her back. Not because he loves her, but because she represents something he cannot tolerate, a challenge to his authority. Judge Crane shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff Clayton, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence? I have substantial evidence, Your Honor. Physical evidence, documentary evidence, witness testimony. Clayton pulled a folded document from his jacket. And furthermore, I have a petition signed by 22 citizens of Hollow Creek requesting that this matter be decided by a jury of their peers, as is our right under the Constitution of West Virginia and the United States. He handed the petition to Crane. The judge's face reddened as he read the names. 22 signatures. That was significant in a town this size. If Crane refused, it could bring scrutiny from the state capitol, the kind that might reveal uncomfortable truths about how justice had been administered in this district. This is highly irregular, Crane said, clearly unhappy. Circuit courts don't typically impanel juries for civil domestic matters. With respect, Your Honor, Clayton said firmly, this stopped being a simple domestic matter when criminal charges of assault and unlawful imprisonment were filed. Both sides have been accused of crimes. Both deserve to have their fate decided by their peers, not by a single judge who might be subject to outside influences. That last phrase hung in the air, a barely veiled suggestion that Crane might not be impartial. The judge's face reddened further, but Clayton had been clever. He had not directly accused Crane of corruption, merely raised the principle that juries were less susceptible to influence than individual judges. Crane looked at Colburn, then at Webb, perhaps hoping for guidance. Webb gave a small shrug, unable to see a legal way to deny the petition without creating appealable error. Very well, Crane said with obvious reluctance. We'll impanel a jury. Bailiff, bring in the citizens whose names I drew this morning. A side door opened and 12 people filed in, 6 men and 6 women representing a cross-section of Hollow Creek. Martha Hayes was among them, and she gave Grace a small encouraging nod. There was Henry Cooper Sr., the blacksmith, a massive man with scarred hands. Margaret Collins, who ran the boarding house. George Wilson, the school teacher. Others Sam recognized by sight, if not by name. They were sworn in, promising to render a verdict based solely on evidence. Martha Hayes was selected as foreman, which Sam took as either very good luck or evidence of Crane's arrogance. Once the formalities were complete, Webb called his first witness. The plaintiff calls Robert Miller to the stand. Miller looked startled, but made his way forward, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. His hands trembled slightly as he took his seat. Mr. Miller, Webb began in a friendly tone, you're the county clerk for this district. Yes, sir, have been for nearly 7 years. And you process legal documents, including marriage certificates? Yes, sir. Did you personally process the marriage certificate for Deacon Colburn and Sister Grace Whitfield? I did, sir. I witnessed the ceremony, made sure the paperwork was proper, filed it according to all requirements. When you witnessed the marriage, did Sister Grace appear to be under any duress? Any indication she was being forced or coerced? Miller hesitated for just a fraction of a second. No, sir. She seemed quiet, nervous like brides are, but not unwilling. She signed the certificate herself. I watched her. No further questions, Your Honor. Clayton approached for cross-examination, walking slowly, giving Miller time to get nervous. Mr. Miller, you testified everything was proper. Let me ask you this. When Sister Grace signed that certificate, was anyone there representing her interests? Any family friends from her convent? Well, no, but that's not unusual for a simple ceremony. Did you think it odd that a woman who had been a nun for years had absolutely no one from her community present? No one to say goodbye or make sure she was making this decision freely. I suppose I didn't really think about it. And the seal from the Sisters of Charity, did you personally verify it, contact the convent to confirm they'd released her and approve this marriage? The seal looked official. It's not my job to investigate every document. Clayton nodded slowly, then changed direction. Mr. Miller, you visited Martha Hayes's general store 2 days ago, didn't you? Miller went pale. I did. County business, checking inventory for tax purposes. And while there, did you remove any pages from Mrs. Hayes's ledger? I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe a page was already loose. Clayton walked to his table and picked up the glass plate photograph. Your Honor, I present this photograph taken by Mrs. Hayes of a ledger page. It shows a transaction on August 15th. Hemp rope 50 feet sold to E. Colburn, cash payment $4.70. The gallery erupted in whispers. Crane banged his gavel for order. This photograph clearly shows a transaction Mr. Miller claims never existed or was lost. Clayton continued. It shows Deacon Colburn purchasing the exact type of rope used to tie Sister Grace 3 days later, and it shows someone destroyed evidence of that purchase. Webb was on his feet. Objection. This proves nothing. Colburn runs a lumber business. He buys rope regularly for legitimate purposes. Then why was the record destroyed? Clayton asked. No further questions. Miller practically fled the witness stand. The morning wore on with more witnesses. Webb called Dr. Bennett, who reluctantly confirmed he'd examined Grace and found no immediate life-threatening injuries, though he admitted under Clayton's cross-examination that he'd seen rope burns and bruises and said nothing about them. Then Clayton began calling his witnesses. Martha Hayes testified about the rope purchase, about Colburn paying cash, and demanding no record about the destroyed ledger page about her photographic insurance policy. Her testimony was clear, angry, unshakable. Henry Cooper testified about witnessing the transaction at the lumberyard, about the distinctive notched boot heel, about finding matching prints at the tree where Grace had been tied. When Clayton produced the boot print photograph, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Your Honor, Clayton said, I request that Deacon Colburn remove his left boot for comparison. Webb objected strenuously. This is absurd, degrading. Crane studied the photograph, then looked at Colburn. Something passed between them, some unspoken understanding. Overruled, Crane said finally. Mr. Colburn, please remove your boot. The moment stretched like pulled taffy. Colburn slowly removed his left boot and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Crane examined the heel carefully, comparing it to the photograph. The notch matched perfectly. V-shaped half an inch deep on the outside edge of the heel. Crane placed the boot on the bench where the jury could see it. The physical evidence was undeniable. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Clayton called his most important witness. The defense calls Grace Whitfield to the stand. Grace stood slowly and walked to the witness stand with measured dignity. She was sworn in, her voice clear and steady, despite the fear Sam knew she must be feeling. Miss Whitfield, Clayton began gently, please tell the court how you came to Hollow Creek. Grace spoke clearly about her life in Baltimore, joining the Sisters of Charity at 18, working as a nurse for 2 years in the slums, surviving the cholera epidemic of 1887. She described being sent to Appalachia to help isolated communities. Then she described Reverend Daniel Cross arriving in town with his traveling revival meetings, how the sisters had invited him to dinner, how he'd asked her to help prepare for the next day's service. He gave me wine, Grace said, her voice steady but her hands gripping the armrests, said it was communion wine, blessed and pure. I had 1 glass, maybe 2. I started feeling strange, dizzy. The room was spinning. She paused, steadied herself. The next thing I remember clearly was waking up in the church basement, alone. My dress was torn, and I knew what he had done. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Grace described telling Mother Superior the convent's response, the forced marriage to Colburn. Then she described the wedding night. He told me the truth then, Grace said, looking directly at the jury. He said I wasn't his wife. I was his lesson, his demonstration. He said people in Hollow Creek were questioning his authority. But if he could control even a bride of Christ, if he could reduce a nun to nothing, then everyone would know not to cross him. She described 3 weeks of imprisonment, controlled food, locked doors, windows nailed shut, then being tied to the tree. He wasn't angry when he tied me there, Grace said. He wasn't rushed. He was calm, like tying up a horse. He said people would find me eventually, that my suffering would teach other women not to challenge him. When she described Sam finding her cutting the rope, giving her water and dignity, her voice softened with genuine emotion. Webb's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested pregnancy-induced confusion, misunderstanding of Colburn's intentions, emotional instability. But Grace did not waver. "I know what happened to me," she said firmly. "I know the difference between care and control, between charity and cruelty. I am not confused. I am not mistaken." When Webb finally sat down, Grace remained standing at the witness box. She turned to face the entire courtroom, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "I am not ashamed," she said clearly. "I am not your cautionary tale. I am a person who survived, and I will not be silent anymore." The silence that followed was profound. Then slowly a woman in the back row stood up. She didn't speak, just stood. Another woman rose, then another. One by one, women throughout the gallery got to their feet. Within moments, 15 women stood in silent witness. Shop owners' wives, seamstresses, teachers, women who had endured in silence but would be silent no longer. Martha Hayes in the jury box stood as well, tears streaming down her face. Colburn's face went white as chalk. These were women from his church, women who shopped at his store, women he thought were cowed, and they were standing against him. Judge Crane didn't bang his gavel. Even he seemed to understand this moment was bigger than his courtroom. Then Colburn himself stood, shaking off Webb's restraining hand. "I have a right to defend myself," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Webb tried to stop him, but Colburn was already moving to the witness stand. He was sworn in and took his seat, Bible clutched in his hands. Webb tried to salvage the situation. "Tell the court your true intentions in marrying Sister Grace." "My intentions were pure," Colburn said, his voice measured but strained. "I saw a fallen woman who could be redeemed. I saw an opportunity to demonstrate Christian mercy. I wanted to give her and her child a home, a name, a future." And the restraint she described. "I restrained her briefly because I feared she would harm herself or the child. I was trying to protect her. I left water nearby. I checked on her regularly. My only goal was to keep her safe until she calmed down and came to her senses." No further questions. Clayton stood for cross-examination, and Sam saw something dangerous in the sheriff's eyes. This was the moment everything depended on. "You mentioned in Christian charity," Clayton began. "Let me ask about Martha Cole." Colburn stiffened. "What about her? 2 years ago, Dr. Bennett asked you to extend $40 credit so he could treat her pneumonia. You refused. She died 3 days later. Then you foreclosed on her family's farm. Can you explain?" "I made a business decision," Colburn said, his calm beginning to crack. "The Coles were already behind on payments. I couldn't throw good money after bad. A business decision that killed a woman. That's an oversimplification." Clayton pulled out a telegram. "This is from Reverend Daniel Cross to you, dated 1 month before Sister Grace was assaulted. It reads, 'Investment opportunity in Hollow Creek. Returns guaranteed. We'll discuss at revival.'" "Can you explain?" Colburn went pale. I don't recall that telegram." "Isn't Daniel Cross your second cousin?" "Distant relative. I barely know him." "Did you and Cross plan what happened to Sister Grace?" "That's absurd. Did you pay Cross to assault her so you could then rescue her through marriage, demonstrate your power, show everyone in Hollow Creek that even a nun wasn't beyond your control?" "That's a lie." Colburn's voice was rising now. Clayton pressed harder. "Then explain the rope purchase. Why did you buy it in secret? Why pay cash and demand no record?" It was for legitimate business purposes." "Then why the secrecy?" "I don't have to explain my business practices to you." "And the boot print? How did your distinctive boot print end up at the base of the tree where Sister Grace was tied?" "I checked on her, I told you that, while she was tied up, while she was suffering, and you did nothing to free her." "She needed to learn," Colburn shouted, standing now. His face was red, his carefully maintained composure shattering. She needed to understand. He stopped realizing what he'd said. The courtroom erupted. Understand what? Clayton asked quietly. That you own her, that you own this town. Colburn, his control, snapped completely. I do own this town. I built the church I created, the jobs I kept Hollow Creek alive. And this is how you repay me, by believing lies from a pregnant nun and a mountain hermit. He was shouting now, all pretense of respectability gone. I own the land, the buildings. Most of you through debt, you think you can change anything. Power protects power. I have more power than all of you combined. Men rushed forward to restrain him. Webb was shouting at his client to stop talking, but the mask had fallen away, completely revealing the monster beneath. Judge Crane banged his gavel frantically until order was restored. Colburn was led back to his seat, still breathing hard, his carefully constructed image in ruins. Clayton sat down, his face carefully neutral, but Sam could see the satisfaction in his eyes. They'd gotten Colburn to confess in his own words. Closing arguments were brief. Webb tried damage control, arguing that his client's outburst was born of frustration at being falsely accused, that the evidence was circumstantial, that a respected community leader deserved the benefit of the doubt. Clayton simply pointed to the evidence. The rope, the boot print, the destroyed records, Bennett's testimony about Martha Cole, Barnes's journal with Grace's own words, and Colburn's own admission that he believed he owned people. The jury retired to deliberate. Sam, Grace, and Clayton waited in the stifling courtroom while the afternoon stretched toward evening. An hour passed, then another. The sun was setting when the bailiff called everyone back. The jury filed in their faces, giving nothing away. Martha Hayes stood as foreman. Have you reached a verdict? Judge Crane asked. We have, Your Honor. In the matter of Samuel Fletcher, what say you? Martha's voice was strong and clear. We find Samuel Fletcher not guilty of all charges. He acted to save a life in an immediate danger. He acted with honor. The gallery erupted in applause. Crane banged his gavel, but the sound was drowned out. Furthermore, Martha continued, raising her voice to be heard, we find Ezekiel Colburn guilty of unlawful imprisonment, assault conspiracy, and gross abuse of power. More applause, louder now. We recommend prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. We recommend immediate removal from all positions of authority, and we recommend investigation into the disappearances of Anna Wright and Rebecca Ford, whose names appear in Dr. Bennett's records. Judge Crane looked stunned. He'd clearly expected a different outcome, but with 12 citizens staring him down and a gallery full of witnesses, he had no choice. Mr. Colburn, Crane said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will, you are hereby remanded to custody pending formal sentencing. Deputy marshals will transport you to the county jail. But then something happened that no one expected. Judge Crane cleared his throat. However, he continued, and the word hung in the air like a dark cloud. However, I must note for the record that the jury's recommendation is just that, a recommendation. As sitting judge, I have reviewed the evidence presented, and I find significant procedural irregularities. The courtroom went silent. Sam felt his stomach drop. The photograph of the ledger is inadmissible hearsay, Crane continued. The boot print comparison was conducted without proper chain of custody protocols. Deputy Barnes's journal was obtained under questionable circumstances and cannot be properly authenticated. And Miss Whitfield's testimony, while compelling, is uncorroborated by any truly objective source. Clayton was on his feet. Your Honor, the jury has spoken. The jury has made its recommendation, Crane said coldly, but I am not bound by recommendations when the law has been improperly applied. Therefore, I am setting aside the jury's verdict and ruling that the charges against Deacon Colburn be dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering that Grace Whitfield be returned to her lawful husband's custody immediately. The courtroom exploded. People were shouting. Martha Hayes was yelling from the jury box. Clayton was demanding that Crane reconsider. But the judge was already standing, gathering his robes, preparing to leave. Sam felt the world tilting. They'd had everything, all the evidence, all the testimony. The jury had believed them. And with one ruling, Crane had thrown it all away. Grace grabbed Sam's hand, her grip painfully tight. He can't, she whispered. He can't do this. But he could, and he had. Deputy marshals were moving forward to take Grace into custody. Sam's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, but Clayton grabbed his wrist. "Don't," the sheriff hissed. "Not here. Not like this." Then something extraordinary happened. Martha Hayes stepped down from the jury box. She walked to the center of the courtroom, positioned herself between Grace and the approaching deputies, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. "No," she said simply, "I will not allow this." The deputies stopped confused. "Judge Crane," Martha continued, "you can set aside a jury verdict. That's within your authority. But you cannot set aside the truth. And the truth is that every person in this courtroom knows what Ezekiel Colburn is. They know what he did. And if you force this woman back into his custody, you'll have to explain to the state capitol why 12 citizens recommended conviction and you overruled them." Other women were standing now, moving to join Martha. Margaret Collins, Sarah Wilson, others whose names Sam didn't know. They formed a line between Grace and the deputies, a wall of bodies and determination. "You'll also have to explain," Martha continued, "why you ignored physical evidence, documentary evidence, eyewitness testimony, why you chose to protect a man who just admitted in open court that he owns people." Judge Crane's face was purple with rage. "This is contempt of court. I'll have you all arrested." "Then arrest us," Martha said calmly. "Arrest 15 women for standing up for justice. See how that plays when the newspapers in Charleston hear about it. See how that looks when the state attorney general starts asking questions." For a long moment, no one moved. The deputies looked at Judge Crane, waiting for orders. Crane looked at the women at the crowded gallery, at Clayton standing with his hand on his pistol, at the situation spiraling beyond his control. Finally, a voice came from the back of the courtroom. "Perhaps I can offer some clarity." Everyone turned. A man in his 50s stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed, carrying a leather satchel. He walked forward with calm authority. "I am James Hartwell, District Attorney for the state of West Virginia. I arrived this morning after receiving an urgent telegram from Sheriff Clayton regarding irregularities in this district's judicial proceedings." He opened his satchel and pulled out documents. "Judge Crane, I have here signed complaints from 22 citizens of Hollow Creek regarding your conduct. I also have Deputy William Barnes's dying declaration properly witnessed and notarized by Sheriff Clayton regarding his role in destroying evidence at Deacon Colburn's direction." Hartwell turned to face the courtroom. "The state of West Virginia is hereby assuming jurisdiction over this matter. Judge Crane, you are temporarily relieved of your duties pending an investigation into judicial misconduct. Deacon Colburn, you are under arrest for unlawful imprisonment, assault, conspiracy, and murder." "Murder," Colburn said, his voice strangled. "Deputy William Barnes died from gunshot wounds sustained while refusing to follow your illegal orders. That makes you culpable for his death under state law." Hartwell gestured to the marshals who had accompanied him. They moved forward and placed Colburn in handcuffs. The deacon's face had gone from red to gray, his eyes wild with disbelief. "This isn't over," Colburn said, looking at Grace with pure hatred. "There will always be men like me. You haven't won anything." Grace stood Sam, supporting her elbow, and faced Colburn directly. "You're right," she said quietly. "There will always be men like you, but there will also always be people like them." She gestured to Martha, to Clayton, to Henry Cooper, to Dr. Bennett, to all the people who had chosen to stand up. People who refused to look away, who refused to let evil win without a fight. We have each other. That's all the victory I need. Colburn was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. Judge Crane followed shortly after, looking 20 years older. The gallery erupted in cheers and tears and relief so profound it felt like a physical thing. Outside the courthouse, people crowded around Grace and Sam and Clayton. Martha hugged Grace tightly. Henry Cooper was crying with relief. Dr. Bennett stood apart, looking like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. District Attorney Hartwell approached Sam and Clayton. "That was well done," he said quietly. "The telegram you sent gave me just enough to start investigating. When I found Barnes's dying declaration in your office, properly witnessed and sealed, I knew we had enough to move." "What happens now?" Sam asked. "Now Colburn goes to trial. A real trial in the state capitol with a real judge and a jury that hasn't been intimidated. Given what I've seen today, I expect conviction and a lengthy prison sentence." "And Grace?" "Free," Hartwell said simply. "The marriage was obtained under duress and fraud. It will be annulled. She's free to go wherever she chooses." 3 months passed. October arrived with frost on the grass and leaves turning gold and red in the mountains. Sam's cabin had become something neither he nor Grace had expected. A home, not through romance or obligation, but through something deeper. Shared trauma transformed into shared purpose. Two broken people who chose every day to build something good from the wreckage. Grace's labor began just before dawn on a crisp October morning. Sam rode down the mountain to fetch Martha Hayes, who'd become not just a friend, but a mentor to Grace in the art of midwifery. Martha arrived within the hour, her bag already packed with everything needed. 47 births, Martha said calmly, rolling up her sleeves. You're in good hands, child. The labor lasted 16 hours. Long enough for Sam to wear a path in the porch boards pacing. Long enough for him to whittle 3 wooden horses without seeing what his hands were making. Long enough for him to remember Catherine's labor, the helplessness, the ending that came too soon. But this time was different. This time Martha was there with skill and knowledge. This time there was help and hope in the possibility of life instead of death. When the baby finally came, her wail was strong and clear, cutting through the October afternoon like a bell. Martha cleaned the infant and wrapped her in the softest blanket they had, then placed the tiny bundle in Grace's arms. A girl, Martha said, smiling through tears, healthy and perfect. Grace looked down at the red, wrinkled face, at the tiny fists waving at the world, and felt something break open in her chest. Not grief, not fear, something entirely new. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Sam entered when Martha called him. He'd carved a cradle from mountain oak over the past weeks, sanding it until the wood was smooth as glass, wanting everything to be perfect. He set it beside the bed, now his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. What will you name her? Martha asked. Grace looked at Byam, understanding passing between them without words. Catherine, Grace said softly. After the woman who should have lived. After the woman whose husband showed me that goodness still exists in this world. Sam's throat closed. He reached out, one finger and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it, gripping tight. He nodded once, unable to speak past the emotion. The cabin had become what Catherine had wanted it to be, a place of life and hope and new beginnings. In Hollow Creek, changes rippled through the community. Colburn's properties were sold to pay restitution to his victims. The lumber mill became a worker cooperative. The church he'd built was converted into a school, with Grace teaching reading and basic medicine 3 days a week. Henry Cooper became Clayton's official deputy. Dr. Bennett stopped drinking and served those who couldn't pay. Martha's store became a true community center where women gathered and spoke freely without fear. One December afternoon, as Sam sat carving a wooden horse for little Catherine while she slept in her cradle, Sheriff Clayton rode up with a letter. Got a request from a town 50 miles south, Clayton said, dismounting. Woman there needs help. Husband beats her, won't let her leave. Local law won't do anything. They heard about what happened here. They're asking if we might come. Sam looked at the letter, then at Clayton, then at the cabin where Grace was feeding Catherine. Before Sam could respond, Grace appeared with the baby in her arms. If you're going, Grace said firmly, then I'm coming too. Not to be rescued again. To help rescue someone else. To show her that survival is possible. Sam looked at her, at the strength forged in fire. He looked at Clayton, at the badge representing the possibility of justice. He looked at the letter, at the desperate plea. We leave in 3 days, Sam said. That'll give us time to arrange care for Catherine and gather supplies. Clayton nodded. I'll bring the wagon at dawn. As the sheriff rode away, Sam stood on his porch looking at the mountains that had been his home, his prison, his salvation. The letter in his hand was crumpled from being read and reread. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. My name is Elizabeth Norton. I live in Weston. My husband beats me. The sheriff is his brother. No one will help. I heard what you did in Hollow Creek. Please, I'm running out of time. Grace appeared beside him, Catherine sleeping against her shoulder. Somewhere a woman is tied to her own tree, Grace said quietly. And this time she won't have to wait alone. In 1906, 17 years later, Sam Fletcher sat in that same cabin with his grandson Thomas. The rifle cleaning ritual complete, the story told, the lamplight flickering as night deepened. Thomas was quiet for a long time, processing everything he had heard. What happened to Elizabeth Norton? He finally asked. We got her out, Sam said. Trial lasted 2 days. Her husband went to jail. She runs a boarding house in Weston, now helps other women escape. And Reverend Cross? Clayton tracked him to Missouri, wanted for similar crimes in 3 states, hanged in 1893. How many women did you help after Grace? Sam was quiet for a moment, counting faces, remembering names. 17 over the next 10 years. Some we saved, some we were too late for, but we tried. Every single time we tried. Thomas leaned forward. You said there were 3 kinds of courage. Which one mattered most? Sam stood old joints protesting and walked to the window. Outside, the mountains stood dark against the stars. The courage to stay, he said. Not when it's easy, but when it's hard. When staying means fighting. When it means standing up, even though you're scared. When it means helping someone, even though it puts you at risk. He turned to face his grandson. You're going off to war. You'll see terrible things. Men will tell you that courage means charging into battle, that it means being fearless. But that's not the truth. Sam picked up the Sharp's rifle, felt its familiar weight. Real courage is the man who stands between the bully and his victim, knowing he might lose. It's the woman who testifies against her abuser, even though she's terrified. It's the community that says no more, even when it's easier to look away. When you're over there in Europe, you're going to see innocent people suffering. You'll have choices. You can fight, you can run, or you can stay and help. And Thomas help. Always help. Because the world doesn't change through grand gestures. It changes through small acts of courage by ordinary people who refuse to let evil win without a fight. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding settling over him like a cloak. What happened to Grace, he asked. And Catherine? Sam smiled, genuine warmth lighting his weathered face. Grace runs a school now in Charleston, teaches nursing and midwifery. Catherine is 17, studying medicine in Baltimore. Wants to be a doctor, first woman in the family. And every year, Sam continued, on the anniversary of that trial, women from 5 counties gather in Hollow Creek. They call it Standing Day. They remember what happened. They remind each other that they're not alone, that they have power when they stand together. He walked back to the table and sat down across from Thomas. That's what came from one mountain man deciding to cut a rope. Not just one woman saved. Not just one villain defeated, but a movement. A change in how people think about power and justice and standing up. Thomas was quiet, absorbing the weight of it all. I'll remember, he said finally, when I'm over there, when I see people who need help, I'll remember what you taught me. Sam reached across the table and gripped his grandson's hand. That's all I can ask, that the lessons don't die with me, that someone carries them forward. The lamplight flickered one more time. Outside, an owl called from the darkness. Inside, 2 generations sat together, one preparing to leave, one preparing to let go. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But the people who lived among them, the choices they made, the courage they showed, that changed everything. One rope at a time, one person at a time, one act of defiance against cruelty at a time. That was the legacy of Hollow Creek. Not just that one woman had been saved, though that mattered immensely, but that a community had learned it could say no to unchecked power. That individuals had discovered they were stronger together than alone. That justice was possible, even where it had been absent so long, people stopped believing it could exist. The story was told. The lesson passed on. Tomorrow Thomas would leave for war, carrying with him the knowledge that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. And Sam would remain in his cabin watching the mountains, remembering the woman tied to a tree and the choice to cut a rope that changed everything. Some stories end, some stories continue. This one would live as long as people remembered that ordinary courage could defeat extraordinary evil. The fire burned low, the night deepened, and in the silence that followed, both men understood that some things were worth more than safety, more than comfort, more than the easy path. Some things were worth fighting for, worth standing for, worth staying for when every instinct screamed to leave. That was the final lesson, the one that mattered most, and it was enough.